In the traditions of the world, there's been often the description of a universal soul. In Hinduism, there's the sense that our truest self and the center of who we are is Atman, A-T-M-A-N, the Atman, or our true self. That's an individual soul, but at the same time, the fundamental assertion of the Hindu tradition is this Atman is Brahman. The single soul is the all-encompassing one. So at the same time you have the individual, you recognize that we're a part of the entirety. So what's shared across all individuals are these fundamental characteristics of Brahman. There's a level of connection beyond what I as an individual can see. When I pull myself out of that individual place, if I move back to the all-encompassing one, I recognize that one is more foundational and the individual self is not the ultimate truth. This great German romantic, Schleiermacher, says that each individual is cut out, as it were, from the all-encompassing infinite. So it's like a blanket of infinite length. And what we call the individual is somebody taking a little pair of scissors and pulling out this one piece, putting it on the wall and saying, well, that's the individual. But nope, if you put it back, you've still got the infinite whole, collective soul. These Hindu ideas of the self being a part of the overall whole actually have a kind of foundation in physics. And the area we can see it most is something called quantum field theory. So first we had Newton's particles, his billiard balls, utterly disconnected. Then with quantum physics, we found ways that the wave and the particle were both related, things were indeterminate, and consciousness helped mold the whole.
You have a positive and a negative element. And the act of even attempting to observe one of them has an immediate reaction on the other, no matter where it is in the universe.
So you can see how the ancient Hindu ideas, this idea of all things being one, have their source, we might say, in this underlying quantum field. Call it the quantum version of Brahman, the ancient Hindu idea. So the science and spirit connection is, for me, fundamental.
That gives you a sense of what ultimate connectedness might be like. And for me, that's where the Holy Spirit lives. The Holy Spirit is God manifesting at the subatomic level, at the level of ultimate connectedness of all matter. And then if you add then to that concept, of God manifesting at that level, the intentionality and a will for good, then I think it perfectly embodies our concept of the Holy Spirit. And it doesn't have to be a third being. There's God manifesting at the cosmic level, the God that knows the names of each of the billions of stars. And then there's God connecting everything at the subatomic level of ultimate connectedness, of ultimate mutability. And then there was a point in time when God decided to manifest in only 4 dimensions so that we might have a little glimpse of God's godness.
Is there a universal soul which unites us all and unites us with the physical and the non-physical world? Plato certainly believed there was such. I use the word spirit to describe the way in which we are united with one another, in which we share something that's extra physical but bonds us together. So if we're going to talk about God's Holy Spirit, that Spirit bonds together unique individuals whose internal self and essence participates in a unity which is greater. It doesn't destroy the soul in order to bind us together in the Spirit.
My personal belief is that the whole comes before the parts. That what is most fundamental is the whole of physical systems, the whole which is an organism, the whole of a society, and it's a big step, but the whole of all reality. Again, what the Hindus call Brahman. The whole is the water in which we swim. The whole is that thing that gives us identity.
As you go further and further deeper, there's no individuality anymore. So maybe that's where the physical universe emerges out of.
And it's here, I think, that the quantum theoretic description is a good description. Because this notion of oneness is deeply built into the math there. And it's what makes the math work. And physicists call it unitarity. You can think of it as meaning that time is perfectly symmetrical. So if you like to think of causation, that causation from the past and causation from the future are equal and intersect in the present. So that's one way to think about unitarity. Another way to think about unitarity is that no information is ever gained or lost. The amount of information in the universe is always the same.
So if you use the word universal soul, that's the way Plato did it, and that's the way Ralph Waldo Emerson did it, etc. That means there's a universal consciousness that's like a big fire, and you and I and our individual souls are like a little spark.
So there's another idea about this oneness, that somehow oneness is a function of seeing one's identity in the one, in the conscious oneness, or an identity with God. And that is what has sometimes been labeled a pantheistic notion, that we are all the mind of God, we are God. I'm not comfortable with that because I feel that we need to have a relationship. And you can't have a relationship inside a one, it has to be a two. So there's a sense of a relationship that we have and that we build, and that relationship is part of what we're cultivating. And so it's the relationship with God and the communion with God, or the communion with creation, is an important part of what we are aspiring to be and to do as humans, but it's not an identification. It's a reciprocal communion of more than one.
So the way that I would describe the collective unconscious or universal soul is that it's that the common inheritance that all humans have. The inheritance comes from the DNA, which is a kind of a conceptual model of the world that's been built up by evolution. And that conceptual model of the world is what allows our bodies to develop the way that our bodies do develop, and that our brain to process the information the way our brain does process information. So in that sense, we all have that in common. We have that common background behind us. So that's kind of the collective unconscious. It's, you know, the structure of the brain that allows it to do that intuition and understanding and the instinct. Those are all built into the brain by evolution. So that's our common background that we have.
I love the concept of universal oneness, and I appreciate and have experienced that sense, that feeling that we get of being connected with everything else, that sense of belonging to everything else. But that's, for me, a very subjective experience, so I know it's me, it's not the universal. And I visualize it in terms of the chains of interconnectedness, where So for example, our DNA has been given to us by our parents. So now we have a connection to our mother and father through the DNA, and through them to their parents and their parents and their parents, and ultimately, perhaps, there was a point in time when the one single-celled animal took over the other, and and we all share the DNA cascading from that point. So you can think about that, and you find a rich, deep interconnection, not only with our own kin, but also with all human beings. And then if you follow that train of thought, with all of life based upon DNA, this DNA structure that we all share, and what we have today came from those single-celled animals. So then you can build a sense of oneness with the body of life, the body of humans and the body of life. And you can also take that now to the next level, because every molecule that you have in your body has come in from the outside. You've eaten it, you've breathed it. It was somewhere else before. All of those molecules were somewhere else before. And for us, most of those molecules have been on the earth for some billions and billions of years and participated in some other organism here or there or in the crust of the earth, or somehow they're all part of us too. So we've got that layer of interconnection with the physicality of the universe. And again, if you take those molecules back down through their history, through the stars, the creation in the center of stars from the original cascade, you can find that sense of connectedness to everything. And it's a beautiful, really a beautiful, beautiful sense of being connected to everything.
Oneness I take as the unified plurality. In other words, rather than absorbing everything into an amorphous unity, I take oneness as the rich differentiation of races, of cultures, of traditions, of religions, but we are bound together with a deeper, new conscious level of love and compassion, peace and respect, a working together, a symbiosis of life. Sometimes you get pockets of oneness. You get small little intentional groups that are really trying to live this, and I think what those groups say to me is, it's possible. We have to keep working towards it. Oneness will never just kind of arrive, like, ta-da, here it is, because we're always working against the limits of our finite being, and wherever there are limits, there's contingency to fall away, there's contingency to isolate, there's the tendency to want to be one over and against the other. So we always have to work against the finite limits of our beingness, which is why I think spirituality has to be at the heart of any quest for unity. We can talk about oneness, but do we want to be one? Do we really want to be a unified Earth community? And I'm not so sure the answer is a crystal clear yes. I think sometimes we like having our individual, privatized, individualized space, and we don't want that tampered with. And so I think it's really the question of oneness is a question of, it's a truth question. Really, do you want to be one, and what would that mean? Are you willing to spend your life for that? And maybe sacrifice some of the comforts you now have. I think we can learn from different tribal communities in Africa and parts of the world that we never attend to, or just unconscious of, where a community, a discussion on oneness would be like, huh? Why would we even talk about that, since that would be our starting point? We are first and foremost community. We share. Many of the African communities, our community is first. This is where we find our identity, in the community. We would never think about someone not having enough clothes or enough food, because our way of life is such that they belong to us and we belong to them. So our question of oneness is a Western question, actually. It's a Western bias question, right? Because we have built a culture and a society of pure individuality, and competition, and of success of the one. So I think, that question also has to reach out and say, are we willing to learn anew from cultures we have forgotten.
Well, one thing we know about being human beings is that we can't be who we are except in relationship with one another. So whatever oneness we have in the cosmos, we don't want to get rid of that. We want to be part of it. So it's best to symbolize the unity of the cosmos as a community. So in the Bible you get the kingdom, right, in which every citizen plays an important role. So I wouldn't want to absorb your and my individual soul into a great ocean in which, like a drop, we become so mixed with the rest of the water that we cease to be who we are. So what God needs to do is somehow or other persuade us that we want to be a member of this divine community, and we do so freely, and that we give our hearts to it, and so does everybody else. And it's a unity with plurality. That's the symbol. Now, can we handle this cosmically? Well, yes. Little things like atoms mimic large things like constellations and galaxies, as well as solar systems, etc. So there certainly is a physical way of imagining a future in which you have individuality and unity all at the same time.
What about the particular direction of the whole? Is it just static, or is there a temporal side? I want to think it with time included. In other words, watch. Let's take the whole and let's set it on a timeline so that the whole itself is developing over time. It has different qualities at the beginning and then through the end. I call this spiritual evolution. So take the whole, this thing that includes all of morality and all of self and all the parts of physics, and now let it develop over time. And what you have, I believe, is that the spiritual dimension arises more and more, becomes more and more important. And you can begin to see the purpose of the whole, what we call the telos, its final direction or goal, as you move through this process of spiritual evolution. Holistic and temporal.
Teilhard de Chardin, the great Roman Catholic theologian, Barbara Marx Hubbard, the New Age leader, believe that the physical world is progressing to increasing mentation, increasing spirit, and hence increasing unity. I do think that God is in the process through the Spirit of binding together separate souls. I think we're going to see a far greater unity of souls through God's Spirit in the future than maybe we had in the past.
I think that the movement from self to realizing that we're part of something much bigger is absolutely crucial to the future of the planet. We are not going to survive without it. But what is the oneness that we're moving toward? I think the oneness has to be human species, life, Earth, and the universe, in that order. When we think of ourselves as part of a community, that community usually stops at the level of a world religion or a nation. But what we need to do is make this huge jump in consciousness to realizing that we are humanity. We are humanity, what it's doing right here. You are humanity right there. We are each the universe where we are. We are what the universe is doing right here. And when we start opening our consciousness to that, then we start seeing all the thousands of emergent phenomena that we are participating in. The larger your consciousness becomes, the more you realize you're bonded to all these things, the bigger your identity. The bigger your identity, the more your power. The more your power, the more likely you will succeed in helping other people to save this planet. So we absolutely have to move in the direction of oneness, but I think it's oneness with humanity and life.
I do think it's the power of the one who is God, who is love, who is compassion, who can empower us to keep moving toward that oneness. So I think it's always a symbiotic relationship and a mutuality between God and us, and God, us, and the Earth planet, the planetary community, which I take not only of humans, but of nature itself. You know, I think we can't just talk about oneness in terms of human community, but I think coming to a new sense of belonging to a world of nature. I think Thomas Berry was so right that we have completely forgot that Mother Earth was here way before we were. And so it's Mother Earth, right? So the Earth is our mother, it's our nurturer, and not just something that's background for human activity. And I think that oneness has to be a return to the Earth as mother, and a return to one another as being part of the Earth community. But that is not just by will alone. It's not because we will it to be so. I think it's because we have an infinite capacity to love, because God is at the heart of our lives. And I think if we could tap into our capacity to love, to forgive, and then to live into the future and forget the past, because the past is already now anyway. So the only thing we have really is to lean into the future.
What if God, instead of being the white guy with a beard, what if God is another name for that whole of all things? In my belief, whatever the individual is comes from her place within the whole. And whatever she returns to is that whole.
When a child is born, my prayer to the parents is that the child will grow into that perfect instance of themselves which existed in the mind of God at the moment of their creation. Yeah. And then imagine growing and nurturing that, and then giving it back to the cosmos at your transition.